Hi, Bret.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
Can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. Available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. All you have to do is search for The Wright Show on your podcast app, and it will be one of the first 70 or so entries you come across. So, you are Bret Weinstein. We've had one conversation before. You, at that point, were well known as someone who, first of all, had this bad experience at Evergreen State, where you were professor of biology, and it was kind of, you could say, to perhaps oversimplify, a run-in with social justice warriors, notwithstanding the fact that you consider yourself left-wing, and I think we're a Bernie Sanders supporter. Nonetheless, you ran afoul of them. It got pretty ugly. You had reason to feel physically threatened. Evergreen, which is a pretty far left, especially as I guess public institutions go, pretty clearly far left. I think let it be known that they just assumed you never showed up again on campus. In any event, you are in exile or something. But, you know, it's an ill wind that brings no man good, and you've become much better known, and now, with just only within the last week or two, you've become known as a member of the, quote, intellectual dark web. I think the name had emerged earlier, but had languished in obscurity as a network of people who, I would say one of the main things they seem to have in common is a certain tension with social justice warriors. Also, I guess, a devotion to free expression or whatever. But in any event, this piece came out in the New York Times by Bari Weiss, I think celebrating, from her point of view, the intellectual dark web. Had these, like, really artsy pictures. Where were you posing? That was... Like,
Yeah.
The amount of money that went into this piece, you know, in these times of scarcity, that was like a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer. Where were you? You were clutching, what, a rhinoceros horn or something?
No, I was standing. Actually, you know, it's funny. There has been a fair amount of, there was initially a lot of people loved those photos. And then there was a moment in the day after it had been published at which things seemed to turn and people began to question them. What people don't seem to get is when the New York Times sends a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer to come shoot you, and he says, I'd like to shoot you in the evening outdoors, you go with it. And that place that I was photographed is actually a favorite place of mine in the woods, walking distance from my house, where Heather, my wife, was photographed actually in our backyard. So, you know, people have argued that there's something inauthentic about the photos, but in some way, the only thing about me standing on that stump that's inauthentic is that I wouldn't usually be wearing a blazer.
Well, there's something surreal about them. It has to do with the lighting and everything. I thought maybe they had taken you to a natural history museum or something. It's like it's on another planet or something. Anyway, congratulations on getting that treatment. I'll let you know when the New York Times sends a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer to get a picture of me. It hasn't happened yet. And anyway, so there was, let me see if I've got a paragraph or two of that Bari Weiss piece. She writes, most simply, it is a collection of iconoclastic thinkers, academic renegades, and media personalities who are having a rolling conversation on podcasts, YouTube, and Twitter, and in sold-out auditoriums that sound unlike anything else happening, at least publicly, in the culture right now, feeling largely locked out of legacy outlets. They are rapidly building their own mass media channels. Now, the whole thing got a certain amount of blowback from the left, and this theme in particular, that you've been pushed to the margins of society, was ridiculed because one of the identified members was Joe Rogan. Who among us would not kill to be on Joe Rogan's podcast? The difference between you and me is you have been. And also, if you go to the original website, there was an intellectual dark web website that listed people before she wrote this. And one of them was Steve Pinker, and he's certainly not locked out of, you know, there's a number, and you know, these Sam Harris, I mean, politically correct on HBO. HBO is not exactly a marginal outlet, you know, so there was a certain amount of ridicule about that, right?
Sure, there was. I will say there's a general rubric, which is there's a search for that which will make this phenomenon go away. And so, yes, there was a certain amount of blowback on the idea that these folks are being shut out. But, if the paragraph you read says that these people are largely shut out of the mainstream media channels, which has been largely true. And the fact that Sam Harris and Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan have built alternative channels that have then caused the people who are participating in this loose network to be noteworthy with respect to the mainstream media that's not on us. So, I think people have set up a bit of a paradox, which is in order for the intellectual dark web to be worthy of coverage by the mainstream media has to continue to fail to cover them. And now that the mainstream media has taken notice, I think it's all to the good, and it raises important questions about how to move forward. But I don't think there's anything substantial in that criticism. With respect to it including people like Steve Pinker, who obviously do have mainstream cachet, you will note none of us know where that website came from. Somebody
Is that true? Nobody?
Yeah. We have no idea. And in fact, Weiss checked with us to make sure it was true, and everybody does not know. So the website was put up by somebody who likes the idea of the intellectual dark web, apparently, but without asking permission or consulting us on who's listed or anything like that.
I mean, I'd also say, Sam's books get reviewed by the New York Times Book Review. I bet he's out. Anyway, we don't need to belabor this. I would also just say that in the current media environment, I mean, it's like, who wants mainstream exposure when you got Joe Rogan? But it's certainly true that some of the, some of the ideas are not welcome by, I guess, mainstream. Well, let's explore that though. I mean, let me read. Okay, so here is Bari Weiss's characterization of another paragraph. I have a gripe with this paragraph, and it's maybe a little too schoolmarmish, but she writes, but they all share three distinct qualities. These are people in the intellectual dark web. First, they are willing to disagree ferociously, but talk civilly about nearly every meaningful subject: religion, abortion, immigration, the nature of consciousness. How courageous to talk about the nature of consciousness. Sorry. I'm going to restrain my snark, but that's... Second, in an age in which popular feelings about the way things ought to be often override facts about the way things actually are, each is determined to resist parroting what's politically convenient. And third, some have paid for this commitment by being purged from institutions that have become increasingly hostile to unorthodox thought and have found receptive audiences elsewhere. Now that certainly applies to you, but my gripe, this is maybe petty, but the paragraph starts, but they all share three distinct qualities. And the third is, some have paid for this commitment, blah, blah, blah. Well, if only some have paid for it, then they don't all share this particular trait. I mean, this is the New York Times. I expect better, right? Is that a legitimate gripe?
I hear you. I'm not sure, the piece was written, it was edited, it was published, there was a lot of back and forth. I know because it took a long time for it to show up.
So you were aware, you knew that this was in the works? I guess you would. They took your picture, sure.
Right, exactly.
So anyway, that's her characterization of it. I guess we've listed some people in it. Ben Shapiro, a Breitbart exile. Dave Rubin, who also has a pretty widely, I guess, listened to podcast. I think used to be with the Young Turks. Michael Shermer, right? A skeptic, founder of Skeptic Magazine.
My brother Eric Weinstein, who actually coined the term intellectual dark web.
He did.
On the Harris podcast. Yes, he did.
Interesting.
My wife Heather, who taught at Evergreen and was driven out along with me.
Mm-hmm. Christina Hoff Sommers.
So who we missed? Jordan Peterson.
Now, I mean, first of all, I'm wondering, to what extent are you going to run with this as a brand? Because I saw a tweet. Okay, so I run Blogging Heads TV, and Glenn Lowry has a show on Blogging Heads TV. He just did this thing with John McWhorter where they talked about, John informed Glenn about the intellectual dark web and said that we've kind of been associated with it, and Glenn's like, oh, cool. And then I guess John or somebody tweeted about it. Your brother tweeted back, the IDW follows you guys, meaning Glenn and John, loves what you do, in parentheses, and well beyond the black take. In other words, well beyond what they say about African-American issues and so on. I already reached out to Glenn Lowry through mutual friend and colleague, I don't know what this Twitter handle is. Hit us up, ? Be well. But my point is, it sounds like he's speaking for the IDW. It sounds like it's a thing, and you decide who's in and who's out. Glenn and John are in.
Well, the thing is, Glenn and John are in, I believe, by virtue of having gotten in the way the rest of us did, which is by behaving in a fashion consistent with the IDW ethos and in a way that is generative. And so, I have no doubt that if anybody reflects on the IDW 6 months from now, Glenn and John will be regarded as in, but it's not as if there's a mechanism of application or a council or something that decides. Effectively, you become part of this rolling discussion, as Weiss put it in the New York Times, by virtue of participating in a way that is worthy of people's attention.
So when you say they are, what'd you say, that they embrace IDW's ethos and are generative or something, what is the ethos?
I think, I'm a fan of both Lowry and McWhirter's. And what I like is their willingness to engage very difficult issues and to do so in a way that is not expedient. I mean, I know Glenn in person. I haven't met John yet in person. We've interacted some, but both of them are willing to say very difficult things, irrespective of the cost. And that, we could come at it a number of ways, but the ability to discover the take that is non-standard and worthwhile and the willingness to voice it in spite of the fact that it has a cost is essentially what characterizes this network of people and what makes the discussions in the so-called rolling conversation so interesting to so many people. Okay,
so here's a question. So it's people who are willing to grapple straightforwardly as they see it with difficult issues, notwithstanding the blowback. But it does seem to me that by and large, these are people who grapple with these issues, notwithstanding the blowback from the left. There is such a thing as blowback from the right. There are people on the right who will try to stigmatize you for saying certain things. I'm not aware of anyone in the intellectual dark web who has run into that problem.
Well, I don't know that that's true. I mean, there are plenty of things. I'm constantly running into the argument that I am responsible for what happened to me at Evergreen by virtue of having coddled that perspective until it finally came for me, which is utter nonsense. I never coddled that perspective. In fact,
meaning the social justice warrior, loosely speaking, perspective, which we can talk about. But
well, I do want to clarify something about the relationship of postmodernism to this movement, because I think this is something people have largely gotten wrong. But Heather and I grappled with postmodernism as college students ourselves back in 1992. And in fact, I failed an anthropology course because I challenged this perspective, and, it cost me my grade.
As I understand it, if you don't like postmodernism, you should not have taken an anthropology course in the first place.
Well, but
these days.
Think about the sentence you just said.
Oh, is that going to get me in trouble?
No, but you're talking about anthropology.
I know. It was
very important. Well, I mean, you're right. But the fact that anthropology has been captured by a perspective that believes effectively that there is no truth to be found, that truth is basically who has the power to...
I mean, I will say two things. Anthropology ran into a problem, which is that originally its mission was to document exotic cultures. It ran out of exotic cultures in the conventional sense a long time ago. In other words, cultures that were just being discovered. That was the Franz Boas, he was happening upon undiscovered, previously undocumented peoples and so on. So they ran into that problem. And there is, I understand, there is, I think, in many ways a very defensible, I don't know if I want to use the word cultural relativism, but an insistence on the anthropologists that they not judge their various, and in particular not impose a Western perspective on their various subjects. Now, I take it that, I take your point that that doesn't necessarily mean saying there is no truth. And I'm not really conversant enough in postmodernism to say whether that's what they're saying. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead with your thing.
Well, my point would be this. First of all, yes, anthropology may have lost new cultures to study. There may be none left. But, if you look at chemistry doesn't have a lot of new ground to cover that is,
You think the elements are pretty well under control, the periodic table?
Well, even beyond that, orbital theory gets us pretty far in terms of predicting what the interactions between different elements is going to be under different conditions. What is true, though, is that chemistry retains tremendous value in the sense of teaching students what's going to take place in a beaker under certain conditions, analyzing what the beaker might contain. So analytic chemistry, these things still have a value in spite of the fact that chemistry is pretty well understood. So the same thing should be true of anthropology. Even if cultures have all been analyzed, I don't know how well they've been analyzed, but even if they have all been analyzed well, bringing people in on understanding those cultures is highly valuable. I mean, to the extent that it corrects for something like a Western bias, that's a potentially marvelous role to play. And the idea that province has been captured by a mind-numbing perspective on truth is pretty shocking. But nonetheless, Heather and I encountered it there in 1992. We weren't fooled by it. We fought back, and we've been fighting back against such perspectives ever since. So what I'm telling you is that the answer to your question that we haven't faced pushback, I've been facing lots of pushback from the right, which says I'm responsible for my own conundrum, which is false, and I have been perfectly clear about that multiple times. So there's that, and there's also many on the far right who are uncomfortable with Jews, and I face more anti-Semitism in a week now than I did in my entire life until May of last year.
What are the grounds of what is the accusation? I mean, usually people who use a slur have something, ostensibly to justify the slur. What is their complaint?
Well, I think their complaint is that there is a quiet cabal of Jews shaping thought in the West for Jewish objectives rather than collective human objectives or American objectives. And, I don't know what to make of it. It sounds to me, certainly if there's a conspiracy, I haven't been called.
Are you facing it more by virtue of the recent developments? In other words, are they saying that the intellectual dark web, it's only existed for a week? Is it already being accused of being of orchestrating all world events?
Well, I don't think we're quite at that level of accusation yet, but certainly there is the accusation that it is effectively a Jewish organization, which there is a desire to portray it as right-wing, male, Jewish, in spite of the fact that, depending upon where we draw the borders, half the people in it are left of center. There are several prominent women within it. There are several people who are not Jewish within it. So, again, what I'm seeing is a hunt for anything that will stick to make the phenomenon go away. And it's not working because any simple rubric you would use isn't going to apply.
Okay, but on this question of whether there is, in fact, on balance, a rightward kind of tilt, notwithstanding your own ideological background. I mean, I saw that I think you had an interaction with Glenn Greenwald on Twitter. I didn't follow the whole thing. I think one of his issues is that, wait a second, there are these right-wing speech codes, which is, and an example is, if you're too critical of Israel or critical of Israel in a certain way, people try to stigmatize you as anti-Semitic. They try to stigmatize Glenn that way, notwithstanding the fact that he's, of course, Jewish. But that's and in fact, as he has argued, Bari Weiss herself, by his account, and I think this isn't totally made up. I mean, I think I haven't looked into it deeply, but apparently, when an attempt was being made to deny tenure to a Palestinian professor, Barnard or something, This was a while ago, but Bari Weiss was apparently to some extent on that bandwagon and so on. And so that kind of feeds the idea that the intellectual dark web, Bari Weiss is after all celebrating it and extolling it, isn't about fearless truth telling in all directions. So it's like, is there anybody in the intellectual dark web who's gotten that kind of blowback, been so critical of Israel that they were accused of being anti-Semitic?
I don't know. My guess is no, but my guess is no for a reason. There are also no authoritarians in the intellectual dark web. Authoritarian would be a deal breaker. So the intellectual dark web is united by a small L libertarian view of the world. To be very clear, since the term libertarian is confusing, I'm not talking about economic libertarians, of which there are several in the intellectual dark web, but people who view liberty as important. The intellectual dark web is taken entirely from that category. Should we be open to authoritarians? I see no reason to do it.
No, I'm not advocating that, I don't think.
No, you're not. But what I'm arguing is the fact that we can find topics on which there is not a full range of viewpoints is not surprising. Essentially, I think there are certain topics on which you would find, we are also not especially diverse in believing that Enlightenment values are a positive force, right? We all have a scientific orientation. On the other hand, there's diversity of opinion on gun rights. There's diversity of opinion on abortion. There's diversity of opinion on atheism. So there is tremendous variation within the intellectual dark web and tremendous disagreement over important topics, but there's civility on each of them.
Okay. There's a question I was going to ask you. We had this earlier conversation, and again, people are interested in how you got to be exiled. Should check that out, or Google you and see any number of other renderings of it. But after we had the conversation, and I knew we were eventually going to have another one, I was going to ask you this question, because I could already see, before the intellectual dark web had a name, I could see you were being drawn into this network. You're on Dave Rubin's podcast, and you favorably tweet each other, and so on, and Sam Harris. And in fact, I was thinking loosely, it looks like kind of a new atheist. I don't know about Rubin, but various people led me to think of it as, having a little bit of a new atheist tilt. But in any event, it also seemed to me that on balance, more right than left. And I was going to ask you, is there, are there sources of discomfort and danger there? It seemed to me, there is this dynamic where, there is this dynamic where the enemy of your enemy becomes your friend. Many of these people had gotten blowback from social justice warriors in ways they considered indefensible, and so they became kind of your allies. But some of them are quite to the right of you. And in fact, there was a letter. Did you see the one letter to the editor that was published? I think after to the New York Times after this Bari Weiss piece. It's the one I saw from someone named Susan Fowler in Berkeley. It says, the dangerous ideas put forth by people, the quote dangerous ideas, Bari Weiss is mocking dangerous, but this woman says, they are no longer discussed because we have collectively agreed that they are wrong. She mentions Sam Harris's seeming embrace of ethnic profiling for Muslims or something like it. And then she has this quote from Ben Shapiro, who is in the intellectual dark web. I noticed that you liked one of his tweets recently, not related to what I'm about to read, but he said this, apparently, and I guess it's true if the New York Times published this letter. Quote, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. Now, I assume you would condemn that as a statement about any ethnic group?
Well, I think it's a pretty good test of what's going on, actually, because when I saw that tweet, I thought, well, that's pretty horrifying. Now, Ben's pretty young, and effectively a tweet from many years ago is circulating. But then I saw Ben's defense of that tweet, which is far more compelling than you would imagine it could be in light of what that tweet sounds like in isolation. And his point, if I understand it, is that he was not talking about individuals. He was talking about leadership, which has sabotaged opportunities for peace, preferring alternatives. And the thing that really surprised me was he said, not only am I, Ben, saying this in the present, but I was saying this then. Have a look at the thread in which the tweet that has been brought back into the present was extracted. And if you look at the sequence of tweets that it's embedded in, would I have tweeted it? Never in a million years. But do I think he's getting a bad rap based on what he apparently meant? Yeah, it's a terrible tweet, and it's extremely badly phrased for what he was trying to convey, and I'm not sure I agree with what he was trying to convey. But is it what it appears to be when isolated in a letter like Fowler's? No, it clearly isn't. So I would encourage people to look at the letter in the Times and to look at Ben's defense, and then hopefully the result of that is you start thinking for yourself about it.
Okay, but just to make sure I understand, what was the context? I mean, this was a freestanding sentence. Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage?
Well, again, I never in a million years would have tweeted that. I would not have liked a tweet. I would have shaken my head at such a tweet. However, what he was talking about was a collective decision. In other words, governance that results in this as a consequence. So, again, I'm not defending the tweet, but I do think to the extent that that tweet is clearly taken out of a context that makes it a question of governance rather than individual preference, it's unfair to Shapiro.
I guess I'm not understanding how that context in any sense exonerates him, but I'll have to go back and look at it.
Take a look at his defense. But in any case, here's the other question, though. I haven't looked at everybody's political compass graph, but my guess is if we graphed everybody in the intellectual dark web, we would find Ben was the farthest right of anybody so far. On the other hand, we would find approximately half, maybe it is half of the people in the intellectual dark web are left of center. So why is there a perception that the intellectual dark web is right of center? What is that perception? Where does it come from?
Well, different people have different perceptions of what qualifies as left of center, right of center. That's part of the problem. I mean, it's not like assessing someone's height or weight. And I guess, thinking it through, I'm just trying to think who is in it, who is not. I mean, I have myself argued that Sam Harris is on significant issues further right than he sometimes presents himself as. He and I have had this argument. I
think you're pointing to the problem. And I don't know how to diagnose it. I don't know if it has a name. But the current rubric on the left is if you differ on any of the issues that the left holds sacred, you aren't on the left, according to them, which I find shocking. That's not how logic works. We live in complicated times. You should expect anybody who is generating their own perspective issue by issue to come out with something other than a standard progressive slate. So the idea that any single violation of the code gets you tossed out of the left is itself an indicator that something is wrong with the left.
I guess it depends on, the other question is, what is the left? And that's a question I was going to kind of ask you. Maybe we should exhaust this a little further. So who besides you is clearly kind of on the left? Like Michael Shermer, I think, first of all, I think a number of these people, some of these people are kind of libertarian in their economic inclinations, but by the same token, liberal on social issues, lifestyle issues. So it gets to be kind of hard to, generalize.
Not really. I am filing what we are currently calling classical liberals with libertarians right of center. And my point is that there is quite a bit left of center in the intellectual dark web. So if you look at my political compass graph, I turn out to be far left. Heather, likewise. Eric, not as far left as I am, but certainly left of center. We have Christina Hoff Sommers, left of center. We have.
Wait, Christina Hoff Sommers, you would say is left of center?
I believe she would say she is left of center.
Well, okay, I don't know exactly her, but certainly on. Well, I mean, all I hear about, I guess, is her position on feminist issues mainly, and you know, I guess so, it's so complicated. We can't parse all this.
I don't think it is that complicated.
But I would say, first of all, doesn't this happen on the right too? Aren't people expelled? Although I will say there's a long-standing, and this goes back decades. This phrase, conservative. What is it? Conservatives look for converts. Liberals look for heretics, or something like that.
Never heard that.
This is a pattern. That's not. It's new. It's not a product of social justice warriorism or anything else. And I don't know that it's always been true. But I remember hearing that in the late 80s. So there may be something there. You know, the other problem is the whole political landscape is so fragmented now. It's like, what do you mean by conservatism? There are people for whom abortion is an absolute litmus test. There's significant numbers of conservatives. You're gone if you venture, you know. But then there are other kinds of conservatives who disagree on abortion, but can be fairly called conservatives.
But I think have you taken the political compass test?
No, I have. I'm afraid to. What is it?
So I will give my standard caveat, which is that I can't vouch for how good the questions are at placing you on this 4-quadrant graph. Mm-hmm. But what it reveals is that, you know, anybody who says that if you disagree on abortion, you're not with us, I would argue that is an authoritarian perspective. That is a desire to enforce a belief system. Mm-hmm. And so at the moment, there is broad reason for alignment between libertarians on the progressive and the conservative side. The real battle is between the authoritarians and the libertarians. So on the political compass, it's the upper 2 quadrants versus the lower 2 quadrants. And I'm sure there are people who would kick you out of the right for believing, you know, for being an atheist, for believing in gun regulations, for believing that abortion is sometimes warranted, something like that. But it is, I'm not so interested in the thought process of anybody who believes the universe is that simple, who thinks that reasonable people simply cannot disagree over issues that are complex. So I think my point is your sense, which is widespread, that there is something right-wing about the intellectual dark web, is the result of a certain kind of calculation. Which
I would say not universally, but my sense has been like unbalanced. And I admit that view is itself biased by which issues I care most about. I admit.
So I would, you know, again, I haven't looked at everybody's graph, but I would say Eric, Heather, myself, and Sam are clearly left of center. I believe Christina Hoff Sommers is left of center. I believe Dave Rubin, Claire Lehman, Michael Shermer are slightly right of center over in classical liberal space, but right of center. Ben Shapiro is clearly pretty far right. Jordan Peterson is hard to peg. But when I do that count, just back of the envelope, looks to me like a 50-50 split between right and left. So what I don't understand is why there is a desire to say, well, but it really is kind of right of center, rather than, isn't it interesting that there is an entity that is so evenly divided between left and right that is interested in having conversations across that divide.
Okay, but there is the fact that, as I said earlier, there are right-wing speech codes. You can run afoul of them and people can try to stigmatize you. Why is it that nobody in the intellectual dark web has run afoul of those speech codes?
first of all, I don't know that it is or isn't true. I'm much less familiar with those codes because I don't travel in those circles. So maybe it's happened, maybe it hasn't happened. Maybe asking some of the folks who are farther right would give you a more nuanced answer. But I will say that at the moment, you have a kind of naive, authoritarian, left-wing perspective that's taking over not only the dialogue on college campuses, but it is also affecting governance, and it's maybe most importantly affecting the culture inside of corporations that govern what kind of discussions can be had in the internet public square.
So we might as well list the main subjects you're talking about. You're talking about, for example, gender differences. Where is speech being constrained? What are the examples of it being perniciously constrained?
Well, I think so. Let's go back to your question from 5 minutes ago. What does it mean to be progressive? And I would argue the core of a progressive viewpoint is the idea that fairness is a high priority with respect to civilization functioning well, and that therefore a certain amount of intervention may well be worthwhile. Whereas conservatives tend to be very skeptical of intervention, which tends to preserve the status quo. They end up conserving the present distribution of, let's say, opportunity, by virtue of the fact that they are reluctant to meddle with the structures that allow civilization to function. So that's really the core distinction. With respect to these conversations on college campuses and in corporations and elsewhere, what is being enforced increasingly is a simplistic viewpoint that, for example, when we have two populations that differ in their representation or their success in a particular endeavor, that we can infer that the cause of that unequalness must be some sort of structural inequity, which is simply false. So what we need is to understand why we have differences, for example, in representation, and to the extent that those things are the result of some sort of inequity, we should address it very carefully so as not to create unintended consequences that come back to haunt us later. But as a progressive, I would say where there's structural inequity, we should think very seriously about what the remedies might be. But where people have chosen differently because of potentially some sort of innate difference, it is certainly within the realm of possibility that males and females fundamentally are different in their interests. To the extent that those interests result in free people choosing differently how to spend their time, should we intervene so that they don't choose differently? Well, I wouldn't think so. I would think we should make sure people have equal access to opportunities, and then we should allow them to choose. And that really provides, two kinds of benefit. You've got the opportunity to do what you want, and you've got the freedom to choose what you'd actually prefer, which strikes me as something any reasonable person should see as positive.
So there I'd say, if what you're saying, if what you're talking about is the inference from unequal outcome that discrimination is responsible for the unevenness of the outcome, whether that's a valid inference is an empirical question. It's hard to get at, but you're saying it's an empirical question. You think the inference could be shown empirically or on strong theoretical grounds to be wrong. And so that's a question of just wanting to see clearly. On the other hand, the tension you're noting between an emphasis on equality of opportunity and equality of outcome is, as you note, a traditional right-left difference. So to the extent that people in the intellectual dark web are arguing to in effect, get rid of equality of outcome as the emphasis, and granted, are arguing that they have a kind of empirical theoretical argument about why this makes sense, but you can see at least why people would look at the intellectual dark web and go, well, it tilts right? I mean, just because these have been left and right themes respectively for a long time.
Well, there has always been a Marxist bent on the left. It is not universal. there is an intellectual left that does not believe in Marxism, and that's the tradition that I come from. There is an enlightened scientific left, and unfortunately, it's now being backed against the wall by people who I think don't know their history very well. I mean, the problem is experiments in equality of outcome have occurred, and they have produced tremendous carnage. And so I don't think, to the extent that that's what you're saying, which is, okay, isn't it natural for the left to have this Marxist view? And so if you don't have that Marxist view, maybe it's natural for people to see you on the right. My point is, well, if it really is a Marxist view and we can all accept that, then forget traditional left-right. Shouldn't we all recognize that there is immense danger to the values that we hold dear as Americans and as free people?
Right. Of course, you can be something other than a Marxist and want the income tax code to be much more progressive than it is. And if you see people attacking the idea of a progressive income tax by arguing that, look, inequality of outcome is, nature's way, these people are of different talents or aspirations or whatever, then, you might naturally have an aversion to that. In any event, my main point is just that, these are traditional left-right differences of emphasis. You're right that the out-and-out socialist experiments don't seem to have gone very well. And it's an interesting question why there's been kind of a resurgence of socialism on the left. I had left it, for dead a couple of decades ago, and I need to have more conversations with people who are out and out socialists. I mean, I think what some of them would say is I'm talking Scandinavia, not Russia in the 50s. But at any rate, enough political philosophy.
Well, no, I think a couple points need to be cleaned up. One, there's a huge difference between thinking that a progressive income tax might be desirable and believing in equality of outcome. Equality of outcome is an absolutely radical objective. It's a utopian objective. And that utopian objective, like all utopian objectives, is extremely dangerous. That is not the same as saying you can't argue for a strongly progressive income tax. I think you can argue for a strongly progressive income tax based on the Enlightenment view of economics, which says diminishing returns ought to apply to the incentive to innovate. And if it does, then a progressive income tax is justified. So I don't want to be grouped with people who oppose a progressive income tax. I think we need to talk about what the tax is for and in what way it is levied in order to know how I would fall out on it. But I do think it is safe to say anybody who doesn't have a very good reason for believing that their equality of outcome argument is valid in spite of the historical examples is not worth listening to with respect to how to organize civilization, because they simply haven't understood the danger of what they're advocating.
Okay, let me ask you a question about your perception of your own psychological reaction to what happened to you, because I think actually much more than some people in the intellectual dark web, you had a genuinely traumatic experience as it's conventionally defined. I mean, first of all, whenever you're actually physically threatened, even if the news account says, no bones were broken, even if it says no fist was, I don't know what happened to Charles Murray exactly at Middlebury, but it's true that whenever you actually feel physically threatened, it gets your attention. I mean, you don't have that kind of experience often. It can have a deep psychological impact. Your experience, I would say, certainly qualifies as traumatic, as I understand it. And I was going to ask, do you worry about the effect of a traumatic experience? And let me just give you. I was listening. What brought this in mind is I was taking a walk and I listened to some little fragment of something you had done on YouTube where you were distinguishing between two kinds of social justice warriors. And I don't even remember the distinction. I remember that neither one was particularly benign, but one was more pernicious than the other. I forget exactly what you said, but I thought, there must be social justice. There must be people who say, sophomores at colleges who say, I am working for social justice and are kind of hanging out with this crowd. who don't fall in either of these crowds, and I just wondered if, like, when you say something about okay, there's two kinds of social justice warriors, or even if you talk about the left monolithically, do you that is the kind of thing that a person can a kind of essentializing of the enemy that a person can do after a traumatic experience, right? Do you worry about that at all?
No, I worry about being misunderstood, and I think you've misunderstood me because the only thing I can come up with that matches in any way your description of two different kinds of social justice warriors is my argument that there are two kinds of people in the social justice movement. There are those that wish to end oppression and those that wish to turn the tables of oppression.
No, I think that was it.
And I would regard one of those as strongly positive, but it has become a tool of the other, is my argument. So I fall out in the group of people who want to see an end to oppression. Mm-hmm. That's the core of my progressivism, is sense that if opportunity is not, I won't say evenly distributed because there will always be bad luck,
right.
But if it's not distributed such that the bad luck is random, if the bad luck falls on one population and not another, there's something to be solved. And so I see those who are interested in ending oppression as they should be my allies. And to the extent that many of them don't understand that and would fight somebody like me, I think they're just confused. I think they don't understand that they've fallen in with this other group of people that's quite dangerous.
Yeah, I guess that was it. Is I took you to be saying there's like the pernicious puppeteers and there's the dupes. They're dupes. It's the puppets and the puppeteers. I was just thinking, well, neither of those is a super flattering characterization. But anyway, you're not worried that your cognition has been warped by your trauma.
Well, I worry about any sort of bias in my perspective, and I spend enough time at it that hopefully I would spot anything there was, and I listen to criticisms so that were I to fail to spot it, somebody else would likely spot it, and as painful as it is, I would hope that I would see it. I have argued that many, Dave Rubin, for example, are suffering from what I call political PTSD, which is that they've had a traumatic experience with the left, and they have retreated to the right. But my point is I haven't actually done that. My values remain exactly as they were before. I've certainly learned some things in this process, but my perspective hasn't changed. So if you see something that tells you that I've been blinded by that traumatic experience, I'd certainly be up to hear it. But my feeling is I'm actually on guard for that. And the fact that my values still remain left of center, even if the folks on the left in general don't recognize me as their ally, that suggests that what you're saying is at least not true of me.
And so what are some of your left of center positions? I mentioned that I think you're a Bernie Sanders supporter, but more specifically, what are some issues?
Well, I would argue that we have a problem with the concentration of opportunity, and that concentration of wealth has become a mechanism for dismissing the whole argument, because reasonable people can disagree over what a tolerable concentration of wealth might look like. In other words, a concentration of wealth that actually reflected people's contribution to human well-being might be desirable. In other words, you reward people who've added something to our to the commons. But I don't think it is conceivable that reasonable people would disagree over the desirability of widely distributed opportunity, right? Even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian, opportunity being widely distributed is part of your model. If it's not widely distributed, then people don't have access to the market in which to deliver the goods that your market is supposed to deliver. So where's my progressivism? My progressivism is in the idea that opportunity is not at all widely distributed at this moment, and that we need to remedy that if the system is to function at all. The other place, I feel almost alone. I feel like the right has never gotten environmentalism, and the left has abandoned it in favor of these symbolic social issues. And in fact, there really could be no more important issue than this one. We are obligated to deliver future generations an earth that is not degraded from the one that we inherited from our ancestors. And we are failing so badly on that front that I feel like no no progressive coalition is valid unless it takes up that challenge. And frankly, we should convince those on the right that you continue to have this wrong. Delivering an earth to our descendants that is not degraded is our number one obligation, and we're falling down on it based on fairy tales, based on cornucopianism that has never been valid.
Yeah. Well, I think I think a lot of I think some on the left just kind of given up on the. Global warming has been so thwarted. Progress on that has been so thwarted by politics. It's still as a value, it's still there. I mean, I certainly agree that on the equality of opportunity front, I certainly wish the left would spend more time agitating for something that I guess, again, they just have decided is a lost cause. But, the much more equal funding of public education, which is kind of scandalously financed, so dependent on local property taxes. That doesn't get much attention on the left, and it may be because of the time spent on identity politics. That's possible, but for whatever reason, because it's an issue that cuts across ethnic bounds. It's not there are white low-income people getting a horrible education, and black low-income people, and Hispanic low-income people, and so on. Anyway, okay, so that's a couple of things. Before we leave the intellectual dark web and just do freeform association, whatever we're going to do next, just quickly, is there a connection of sorts to this thing called the Heterodox Academy, which I'm sure you're aware of? John Haidt started it with Steve Pinker, and in fact, I think Glenn Lowry, maybe John McWhorter, signed on to that before they, back when the intellectual dark web was a gleam in Barry Weiss's eye. There's a lot of now that actually is a formal organization. They have a website. They put up videos, and that certainly began, as I understand it, as a reaction against. Well, I keep saying social justice warriorism. I hope these people. It's not that they're against social justice per se, but they perceive social justice people. They call social justice warriors. It's their term. It's not what I think so-called social justice warriors call themselves, but they perceive these SJWs as oppressive of free speech or as constraining of speech and so on. So that, I assume there seems to be a lot of overlap between Heterodox Academy and intellectual dark web.
Well, I think Heterodox Academy and the intellectual dark web are fellow travelers. I think they are traveling in parallel, and they are united by a recognition of the danger of enforcing these simplistic belief codes on college campuses. The intellectual dark web is concerned with issues well beyond college campuses. Heterodox Academy is a bit more focused on the academic questions. But, I will say I was a member of Heterodox Academy before what unfolded last year at Evergreen. I saw it coming.
You were?
Oh, yes.
Interesting.
Oh, yes. And I know John Haidt. I don't know him real well, but we have conversed about that and other topics. And I think it's fair to say we like and respect each other. So, I would hate to, given the danger of the backlash against the idea of an intellectual dark web, I would hate to see Heterodox Academy compromised. On the other hand, in terms of values, I think there's pretty good alignment. There's a difference in emphasis, but we regard, I don't want to speak for any we. I certainly regard Heterodox Academy as a positive force in the world, and I hope that the IDW becomes something that they regard as allied in the quest to preserve Enlightenment values.
Okay. So what are there things you wanted to talk about? I mean, there are other things I could bring up, but I don't know. I don't know to what degree we've been pretty well focused on the ramifications of the intellectual dark web and the political ground that it sits in. Other things we might talk about are pretty far afield from that, I guess. That's permissible. I mean, I can think of things that aren't totally unrelated from it that I could bring up, but if you have something totally far afield, people might find that refreshing, if there are any still listening at this point.
Well, I don't know. I certainly, I find myself in a bind, which is that the world tends to be fascinated by what's happening on college campuses and the conflict between social justice warriors and people defending Enlightenment values. I'm much more animated about the importance of evolution to navigation as human beings. In other words, humanity depends on an evolutionary understanding in order to navigate through the novel territory that we find ourselves in. And I don't find that evolutionary conversation exists almost anywhere. So, you and I, given that we share an interest in the evolutionary nature of human beings, we could talk about that, and I certainly think it's very important.
Yeah. Well, what did you have in mind? I mean, well, what did you have in mind? I mean, yeah, I wrote a book about evolutionary psychology, the moral animal, like long, long ago. And my book Nonzero had elements of evolution in it, both cultural evolution and biological. So your book Nonzero actually influenced some of my work. I thought there was an idea in there that was very compelling, and I spent a good deal of time building on the foundation that you laid down in that book. What was the idea? I hope I haven't forgotten it. I hope there's a flicker of recognition when you mention it.
No, it's right on the cover. It's the idea. It's been a long time since I've read your book, Bob, but I think what you said is that evolution does have a direction, and that direction is the seeking of non-zero opportunities.
Okay, well, seeking is a word you'd want to be careful about. I mean, I did argue strongly it has a direction, and there are a number of evolutionary biologists who agree that, well, who believe that, for example, the evolution of intelligent life was very likely. That means that the crossing of several thresholds were likely. You got to get from simple cell to complex cell to multicellular and so on, and other things have to happen. And yeah, I tried to argue that that was very likely. And one of the key driving forces was, you might say, just the fact of non-zero-sum dynamics. I mean, I suppose you can imagine living in a universe, I guess. I mean, you can't imagine it, but I suppose there could have been a universe in which there weren't non-zero-sum dynamics. I don't know. But if there were such a thing, complex life would not evolve. And that is, yeah, I mean, I see what you mean by seeking, because you don't have to interpret that teleologically. I mean, the reason I stopped is because I have separately argued, and this is a separate argument, that there is at least some reason to hypothesize or speculate that maybe a larger purpose is in some sense unfolding through the directional evolution. This is not woo, because the unfolding would still be entirely materialistic. It would just be a question of, like, what set natural selection in motion. Wouldn't have to be an intelligent being for it to be teleological. I just made the mistake of having a big argument with Steve Pinker about this on this very show. But anyway, I want to bracket that I think there's a sense of the word seeking that's not teleological necessarily. It's just that by virtue of paying off genetic the rewarding of genetic fitness that natural selection does, and here we mean fitness just in the kind of tautological sense of whatever gets most genes into the next generation. The rewarding natural selection by definition selects things that do the best job of that, and as it happens in this universe, doing the best job of that involves finding, you might say, whether or not if seeking is too spooky for you, then finding, happening upon, right, non-zero sum opportunities, structures that realize non-zero sum benefits. Yeah, okay.
In some sense, I think you're working too hard to avoid.
Well, I've gotten into a lot of trouble for this.
Well, I know you do. And I see a lot of people afraid of this kind of thinking, but at some level, if I say that a maple tree puts out leaves in the spring to capture sunlight in order to make cellulose and sugar, we can, as Dawkins did in The Selfish Gene, we can go back and we can purify the language a little bit if we have to be perfectly precise. But the fact is, I haven't unless you're confused, I haven't said anything that isn't defensible with respect to what the maple tree is doing.
No, except the difference is that the metaphor of intentionality that you used, you were applying to natural selection and not to the product of natural selection. It's pretty uncontroversial to talk about purpose imbued in organisms by natural selection. Dan Dennett will talk that way. But he doesn't want to talk about natural selection having a purpose, which I think is at least conceivable, and it's because you used that intentionality kind of word in applying it to natural selection that I did this massive clarification that was probably unnecessary. I'll stop now. Go ahead and say whatever you're going to say.
Well, all I would say is that I think, I do understand at the very bottom level there's a danger in misleading people into teleological interpretation. But the fact is we are looking at an evolutionary system in which natural selection has been amplified by the discovery of all sorts of mechanisms that make it more powerful than it must have been at first. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there is a difference, or an important one, between the teleological wording of what the maple tree does and what natural selection does. Natural selection seeks opportunities in a way that's not a precise way of describing it, but it's accurate enough. Yeah. In any case, when I read your book and I started to think about non-zero sum dynamics, I agree with you that there's always something desirable. The extent that a particular lineage has a non-zero opportunity within reach, finding it is always desirable. But where you and I might differ is that I don't think it is that selection is seeking those opportunities in an exclusive way. I would argue that there are different phases of natural selection, and that some of them are non-zero and they're characterized by certain features, and that other stages are zero-sum, and that what takes place during zero-sum dynamics is very important as well. And in fact, it may be the dominant case. The non-zero opportunities are temporary by their very nature because creatures tend to exploit them to the point that they become zero-sum opportunities.
Okay, I mean, I'd say, first of all, I don't think this is what you're saying, but it's certainly important to emphasize that, in a certain sense, driving the whole process is a zero-sum game between organisms to see who gets the genes into the next generation. There's that competitive dynamic, but that's not what you're saying. You're talking about actual phases in evolution where one or the other document. How long is it? What do you mean by phase? How long is a phase?
Well, let's start with your premise that a discovery of a non-zero opportunity is effectively a win evolutionarily, that a lineage that taps into some unutilized or underutilized resource gets a burst of well-being for that discovery. But that burst of well-being tends to be converted into more members of the lineage to the point that whatever was in excess to begin with is no longer in excess. So if you imagine, for example, a monitor lizard in Indonesia that, let's say it's a monitor lizard that swims from one island to an island that isn't inhabited by a similar creature, but that the island is hospitable to it. When it arrives on that new island, there might be a potential for 100,000 creatures of that size using the resources that it uses to live, and there might only be one to begin with. And I've chosen monitor lizards because we've seen parthenogenesis in monitor lizards, so it's possible for one individual to start a new population. But in any case, what that means is that you've got a phase of evolution that is going to take place as the animal reaches towards carrying capacity, and then another phase will kick in at the point that carrying capacity is
there's relatively little competition in Darwinian terms between the lizards for a while. Is that what you're saying?
I would never say that. I know many colleagues who would, but this is where I differ with them, is that there's all this talk about relaxed selection in these periods where there's more resource than necessary. And my argument would be that is a period in which there is a different kind of competition unfolded, that there's effectively a competition to capture resource faster than one's competitor. So if you imagine two populations starting on alternate sides of an island, they're not in a relaxed period of selection. They're in a different kind of race. And that different kind of race involves who captures the territory and learns to exploit it first. So this is what I mean by different phases, that The periods that some folks would dismiss as relaxed selection, I would say, are a different kind of selection, and that creatures that we see are ones that are good at competing in all of the phases to which they are regularly exposed. So each lineage would have to have characteristics that are good in the non-zero phases and good in the zero-sum phases.
So you'd say that human beings are an agglomeration of traits that were good for the zero-sum phase and traits that were good for a non-zero-sum phase.
Very much so. And this is actually one of the reasons that I think we have to understand evolutionary dynamics if we are to survive as a species, is that what we do not intuit is that which we are today will shift into a different mode when it detects that the non-zero phase is over. Uh-huh. So at the moment, we live in a period of abundance. That period of abundance will cause the traits that go with abundance to be dominant. At the point that abundance gives way to austerity, you would see the other traits. And I would argue that this dynamic is actually responsible for the shifts like the ones we saw in Germany in the 30s.
So you're talking about, I mean, it's been noted that if you send people cues of scarcity, it changes it changes their psychology and the way they behave, and maybe the way they behave toward other people. That's the kind of thing you're talking about.
That is exactly what I'm talking about. And I don't want to paint it overly cleanly. The fact is, some excellent characteristics emerge in the face of austerity because people put aside their differences to fight. But in general, what they fight is other people.
I guess, I'm wondering, when you talked about these different phases, I imagined entire generations persisting within one phase and entire generations persisting within another, whereas the psychology of scarcity versus the psychology of abundance, I can imagine that both of these psychologies resulting from selective pressures that exist within a single generation. There are scarce times, there are less scarce times, right?
Well, there are scarce times, there are less scarce times, there are transitional times, and I don't want to get too complicated here, but these things exist in a fractal relationship. I mean, we could rate minutes of the day as to whether or not they are minutes of abundance, and it would be almost pointless to do it.
So it could be either intra-generational or encompass multiple generations. Your model applies to both?
It applies to all of those scales. It's relevant above some trivial scale. Now, here is the place where maybe the two conversations that we're having intersect. I'm
waiting for this. I think it seems like this is going to take some real creativity, but have at it.
Let's see how I do. My point would be, it is one thing. Let's imagine that you have two programs within you, and one of them is appropriate to non-zero sum dynamics, and the other one is appropriate to zero-sum dynamics. And then let's imagine that there's a transitionary period. What is the toolkit for the transitionary period? Well, that is something that must exist. Logic tells us it must exist in human populations because human populations have moved between niches so many times. I mean, both in time and across space. Human beings change what it is they do. They change what it is that feeds them. So, the ultimate example of this would be the population that was living in the Bering Strait during the last ice age. Some fraction of that population made it into the northwest corner of North America and then spread across the Americas and created a population at the point that the Spaniards arrived that may have been 50 to 100 million people doing at least hundreds of different things, if not thousands of different things to make a living. So one population doing effectively one Stone Age thing became many populations doing all sorts of things, including extremely advanced farming under very inhospitable conditions, hunting of large aquatic mammals, things like that. So the software necessary to switch from one mode of living to another must be special software in order to bootstrap skills that the population you came from didn't have. Now, the connection is, I would argue, that what the intellectual dark web is it is effectively dusting off a toolkit that is useful for transitionary times when the heuristics that you have been using give way. People will tend to be confused in a moment where the software they are using is not appropriate to the thing to which they are applying it. And so in such a moment, you will tend to have to default to some kind of first principles fundamental thinking. And first principles fundamental thinking, it turns out, is regarded as hostile by people who are using heuristics of one sort or another. So I do think...
Okay, so first you're saying people in the IDW are employing capacities that were designed by natural selection for transitional periods.
Yep. And you would expect that to be accompanied by a set of beliefs that does not fit a particular slate. But that would be the hallmark of it.
This is blowing my mind. But you're saying that, are you saying that this capacity is the return to first principles because in periods of transition, you just have to step back and go, let's reevaluate fundamentals here. Is that it?
Right. I mean, let's take the example I used before. Let's imagine that you were a member of what we now think was a population of a couple thousand people living on a frozen grassland in the Bering Strait during the last ice age. And then someplace, we don't yet know the exact date, but let's say it was 15,000 years ago, some fraction of that population skirted under the ice sheet that still covered what is now Canada and found itself in the Pacific Northwest, actually not far from where I'm living would be the place that it first found a landscape that was not decimated by ice. So that population is now faced with, it doesn't know it, but it's faced with two continents that have no human competitors on them, that have a large number of creatures that they've never seen, that they don't know how to hunt, but are made of meat and can therefore be eaten. So you could imagine the conversation that would unfold around the campfire in that circumstance. The thing that we've been doing maybe doesn't work so well where we are, but we can all look around and see that there are certain things here that surely are edible. Can we figure out how to outwit them?
So give me an example of a first principle that IDW people are revisiting that the rest of us are failing to revisit.
That's a good question. I would say, so if you look at, Eric's area of specialty.
This is your brother.
This is my brother. His areas of specialty.
Can he put me in touch with Peter Thiel?
Can he put you in touch with Peter Thiel?
Yeah. I just want to borrow just a couple of $1 million at very low interest.
Oh, you want to borrow money? Yes, then I don't think he can. No.
Okay, never mind. Anyway, your brother runs this Thiel Capital thing or something. Something.
Yeah. He's because
that would be that's transitional thinking on my part. I want to move from one stage of my career to another, and I just need a couple of $1 million.
Right. I can't help you. I mean,
okay.
I'm still...
Okay, sorry. Okay, then go back to your theory.
What we have are several different kinds of expertise, right? So, and expertise may be not quite the right description, but several different areas of focus. Heather and I are evolutionary biologists with a deep interest in the interface between genes and culture, which is an interface that I think you and I would probably agree has not been well understood by evolutionary biologists and evolutionary psychologists.
Depends on the evolutionary psychologist, but...
who do you think has done it well?
Well, guys, it's a little abstract. I mean, what do you think most of them are missing? And maybe I'm missing it. What do you think people are missing about the interface?
I would argue that...
I mean, I think John Tooby and Lita Cosmides are good evolutionary psychologists. I think Martin Daly is, though I don't think he's done a lot of culture stuff, and Margot Wilson, his late former wife. But anyway, go ahead.
So what I would say is when Richard Dawkins published The Selfish Gene in 1976, he laid out a model of cultural evolution that legitimized the scientific discussion of that process, but that it did not correctly present the relationship between this new evolving landscape and the genes that were somewhat well understood at the point
the
he
new
published.
evolving landscape being the evolution of culture itself, the evolution of cultural units, which he dubbed memes, a term that, like so many terms, is now used in a way that wasn't exactly originally intended.
Yeah,
it's a subset of what was intended. What are called memes are memes. It's just that he had a much broader definition. Any unit of cultural selection is a meme, a song, a belief, anything.
Right. So when he did that, though, I believe his phrase, also been some time since I've read his book, but I believe his phrase was that the landscape of cultural evolution was a new primordial soup. I believe he uses that analogy. I should say I'm having a discussion with him in Chicago in October, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing this question with him. My argument would be the relationship between the genes and the mimetic cultural evolutionary landscape that sits on top of it cannot be one in which the mimetic landscape is effectively a new primordial soup. It must be true that in order for the genes to make that landscape available to culture, culture must, on average, serve the interests of the genes that allow it. If it didn't, that cultural landscape would be shut down by the genes, which are upstream and therefore have the ability to shut down anything that doesn't serve their interests.
Well, I think the counterexample that he may have mentioned is heroin addiction. That's a pretty self-replicating, pretty successful self-replicating habit. At least it doesn't die out, but it often comes at the expense of its biological host.
Well, I was careful in what I said. I said that landscape has to serve the genes on average. Yeah. On average or better. And I believe it's way better than on average. Yeah. But at least on average it must be true. Otherwise, the genes would shut down the capacity of the mind to take on these cultural attributes. And so
it's not that using the cultural thing has to maximize your genetic proliferation. I mean, if that were the case, contraception could not have evolved. It's just that in some minimal sense, it can't completely undermine the genetic stratum on which it depends.
Well, I hate to do this, but no, I disagree with you. It actually has to serve the interests of the genes sufficiently well that turning it off would be harmful. And my
harmful
point
to the genes?
Yes, harmful to the genes, and that we can infer something about what its value to the genes must be based on the immense cost of that which is transmitted culturally. And, not just the cost of the memes themselves, but the cost of acquiring them. A childhood that lasts 15, 18 years is an immense hazard to a creature whose objective is to produce offspring that carry its genes into the next generation. The danger of your offspring dying before they ever reproduce is so high when childhood is that long that there has to be a very good reason for us to tolerate it.
Well, in a way, the way I'm reacting gets back to my, big picture. I was saying, it could be the case that in some sense evolution is mediating the unfolding of some larger purpose. I mean, part of the idea there is if you stepped back and viewed all of evolution, including cultural evolution, in time lapse, you're viewing it from Mars, it would look almost like and you get to this point where we have this internet, this thing that looks like a giant global brain. You could say, well, that whole thing looks almost like the unfolding of a giant global superorganism. We're not there yet. I mean, because for one thing, the human species is too fractured and contentious, but it kind of looks like that. And so leaving aside the question of purpose, I'm just kind of thinking that for purposes of the construction of the internet, I mean, if you view the interest of the memes that constitute the internet, if you view the infrastructure of the internet as a kind of a global superorganism, or maybe the interweaving of the, you might want to include the human brains that are mediating it and so on. But in any event, its interests, it is in some sense indifferent, in quotes, to the relative genetic success of the different people. All the internet, quote, cares about is that the human species survive and enough people know how to maintain it. And I know this is starting to sound like crazy talk to some people, but I think you know what I'm saying, kind of.
I do. I would caution that your example of the internet and your example of modern birth control are both, they both run afoul of the same problem, which is that they are so novel that we cannot, in fact, say anything about what their net effect is with respect to the genes that gave rise to the technologies that constitute them. So, if birth control lasts 10,000 years, we'll be in a very different position to say something about it, what its implications are. Likewise, the internet. But the internet, in some sense, it has the evolutionary status of a forest. A forest is a collection of evolved creatures doing things that are sensible. But you can't look at the forest and say, is the forest doing things that are sensible? That is an overfitting of
Well, you can say, is the forest doing things that are conducive to the survival of the forest or to the extinction of the forest?
You can't really.
Well, for example, if the human species had hunted to extinction some prey that was absolutely essential and had died out as a result, you could say that about it, right?
Populations can do that.
Yeah.
It's relatively difficult because either you're a generalist, and so any particular species is not essential to your continuing on, in which case you can hunt them to extinction, or you're, did I say that correctly? If you're a generalist, you can hunt any individual species to extinction because you're not depending on it. If you're a specialist, as you hunt the thing to extinction, your population will drop and your hunting will slow and it will persist. And so, the forest, you could ask, it is not coherent to ask the question if the forest acts to preserve itself, because let's say that some species was going extinct within the forest. Will the forest take any recognizable action to preserve some species within it? Because
I'm not saying the forest is actually selected to look out for its interests. I mean, I'm not like a big group selectionist, and I don't think selection very often happens at the species level. I'm just saying it's meaningful to talk that way.
Well, I think this is far more important that we be careful how we speak than the issue of seeking in evolution. The difference between what a creature will do and what a forest will do is a meaningful, important difference that has implications for the behaviors we should be looking. And, within ecology, you will find people who see this as a non-distinction, who do think of forests as evolved rather than forests as collections of evolved entities. And I would argue it has caused a great deal of confusion. So it's a border that we should look out for because it actually predicts different behavior when you jump from the level of a species within the forest up to the level of the forest.
Okay. So I'm thinking we probably should not go on a lot further in this vein, partly because I have to finish a piece that I'm supposed to send in tonight. You're never going to guess what. It's a piece that I'm afraid your friend Sam Harris is not going to like.
That.
It's about the psychology of tribalism, and it is a modest argument that he and the new atheists, well, by implication, the new atheists, are not immune from the psychology of tribalism. It's a little bit of a hobby horse from mine, but it grows out of some assertions he's made in the past that he could be confident that in a particular interest had transcended this. He was not being tribalistic. And my point is these tribalistic biases, the cognitive biases that I think constitute the psychology of tribalism are extremely subtle. And I think any of us should be very careful about ever saying that we have risen above them. And I think in fact, if there's like one thing that could be our salvation at this point in terms of like American politics and everything, it's like more intellectual humility, more of us being open to the possibility that actually our cognition is biased. But anyway, so I
would point out the mechanism to get to the place that you were advocating, I would argue, far better than just simply being open to that possibility, is to engage in dialogue with people with whom you fundamentally disagree about issues. And so I would argue that this is actually the reason that something like the intellectual dark web must exist, is that people who, I'm not a new atheist, and I'm in dialogue.
Are you an old atheist?
No, I wouldn't call myself an atheist at all.
Fascinating. What are you?
Let me lay it out this way. I do not believe that there is anything supernatural going on in the universe. However, I do believe that the structures that constitute such belief systems are there for a reason, and that understanding those reasons is very important, especially at a moment of transition, because to the extent that atheists tend to want to throw out those structures wholesale because they're predicated on what they see as pure fiction, we are in danger of throwing out mechanisms that are essential to our survival that we don't yet even understand how they function. So my interest is in making sure that as we recognize that we may have outstripped the wisdom contained in many ancient traditions, that we haven't done so fully. And what we've really failed to do is to catalog what wisdom exists there, so that as we grow into some new phase, we are capable of retaining the structures necessary to our flourishing.
Okay. As I understand, I wouldn't call that incompatible with a certain kind of atheism, but it's certainly a different song from the one Sam Harris is singing.
Well, and if you think about, you've got Sam Harris in one place,
Jordan Peterson in
another, and you've got me in a third, and that dialogue, I would argue, is pretty rich by virtue of the fact that the disagreements are real and they are over something of substance.
Yeah. Okay, so we should have another conversation at some point because there's a number of things I'd like to. We could do religion for a whole thing. We could do psychology of tribalism for a whole thing. And every time I hear Jordan Peterson, I definitely want to interrogate him on his religion. It's still a little sketchy to me. But I don't know. Have you had a conversation with him?
Of course.
On this stuff?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm moderating a conversation. It's going to be on 2 consecutive nights in Vancouver in June. So this issue is sure to come up. So Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson will be in dialogue over presumably issues that are related, and I'll be moderating.
Well, good. Well, the other thing we could take up in a future conversation is this whole business of whether the IDW is drawing on these transitional skills involving a return to an exploration of first principles.
Great.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
I'd be excited to have that.
I'm on the edge of my seat about that one.
Good.
I like to think I'm capable of revisiting first principles, even though I'm not in the IDW, but possibly deluded. I'm possibly deluded.
I don't think so. I mean, there's a reason that Nonzero caught my attention and caused me to rethink how evolution functions.
Oh, good. Well, I'll take that as a compliment that I'm happy to close on. But so thank you. I got to get back to vilifying Sam Harris.
All right.
It's a job that somebody's got to do. There just aren't enough of us working on it.
I guess.
I really appreciate the time, Bret.
All right.
And enjoy these various interesting conversations you're going to have. And let's have one again before terribly long.
Good. Thanks, Bob.
Okay.